The Supreme Court chamber was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and steals the air from your lungs. Every sound, a cough, a rustling page, the distant hum of cameras, seemed louder than it should be. Even the soft clicks of polished shoes against marble echoed like drum beats warning everyone that something monumental was about to unfold. Dozens of journalists shifted in their seats, pens poised, lenses ready, their whispers falling into uneasy hushes. Law clerks clutched binders tighter than usual, their knuckles pale against the weight of history they were about to witness. And then all eyes slowly turned to a single spot near the center of the room. A polished wooden podium stood there, small and unassuming, yet today it would become the stage for one of the most high-stakes confrontations in American legal history. That was where Jasmine Crockett would stand. The tension inside the Supreme Court wasn't just palpable, it was alive. Journalists lined the back walls, their cameras ready to capture every flicker of expression, every subtle reaction. Lawyers whispered in tight circles, flipping through their notes like soldiers loading ammunition before a battle. In the gallery, citizens from across the country leaned forward in their seats, holding their breath. Some clutched tiny American flags. Others sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the bench, knowing that today's decision could forever change the future of their vote. Outside, the streets of Washington buzzed with anxious energy. News vans lined the blocks. Protesters waved signs and chants rose above the autumn air. Rumors had been spreading for weeks, whispers that this wasn't just another legal dispute. This case could decide the fate of millions. Everyone in that chamber knew this wasn't simply about Texas. This was about the meaning of democracy itself. Behind the heavy wooden doors, Jasmine Crockett stood alone in a narrow hallway, the muted echoes of the courtroom murmurs bleeding through the walls. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, forcing her heart to slow its pounding rhythm. This was more than a legal battle. This was a fight for millions of unheard voices. She thought of the elderly woman in Houston who told her she'd given up voting because her nearest polling station had been shut down. She remembered the single mother who rode 3 buses just to cast her ballot, only to arrive and find the doors locked. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were lives. Jasmine's hands tightened around the thin binder she carried. Inside were the arguments she'd sharpened for weeks, the facts she'd memorized, and the evidence that could shift the balance of American democracy. She knew the stakes. One misstep, one missed word, one single crack in her defense, and millions of voices could be silenced. Maybe forever. Taking one last deep breath, she whispered to herself, "This isn't about me, it's about them." Then she stepped toward the doors, ready to face the most powerful court in the country. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in the marble halls of the Supreme Court. It began in a modest neighborhood in St. Louis, Missouri, where the streets told stories the history books refused to print. She grew up in a middle-class family that worked hard but never had it easy. Her father, a factory worker, often came home with tired hands and silent worries. Her mother, a school teacher, carried a quiet determination to give her children a better life. But even as a child, Jasmine saw the cracks in the system. She watched neighbors turned away from polling stations because their names were missing from the voter rolls. She saw friends' parents arrested without explanation and heard whispers about cases that were never brought to trial. By the time she was a teenager, Jasmine understood something most adults struggled to admit: justice was not automatic. It had to be fought for. That belief shaped everything she became. Before stepping into politics, Jasmine built her career as a civil rights attorney, fighting cases where the odds were stacked against ordinary people. She took on police misconduct, voter suppression, and racial discrimination, and she won. One of her landmark victories came when she secured a $4.5 million settlement for the family of a young man who had been wrongfully shot by police. These battles weren't just cases, they were proof that one determined voice could change lives. And today, standing before the highest court in the nation, Jasmine carried not just her arguments, she carried the weight of every person she had ever fought for. Most members of Congress would have stepped aside. They would have let a polished team of high-profile attorneys handle the arguments, carefully scripted and rehearsed down to the last word. But Jasmine Crockett was not most members of Congress. She made a choice that stunned Washington. She would argue the case herself, standing alone before the 9 most powerful judges in America. It wasn't because she distrusted the lawyers. It was because she trusted herself more. No one knew this case better. No one carried its weight like she did. The law being challenged had ripped through her own district, shutting down polling stations and silencing the very people she represented. For Jasmine, this wasn't just a legal battle. This was personal. She wasn't just fighting a statute, she was fighting an entire system designed to make voting harder for the people who needed their voices heard the most. Her advisors warned her, the Supreme Court isn't the place for risks. One mistake could cost millions their rights. But Jasmine's answer was calm, almost quiet. I can't ask others to fight a battle I'm not willing to fight myself. And so she prepared relentlessly. Long nights bled into mornings. Every argument memorized, every citation sharpened, every question anticipated. This wasn't just strategy. This was survival. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium, the attack began. Justice Alito's voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Congresswoman Crockett, if this law applies equally to every polling station in Texas, how can you possibly claim discrimination? Before Jasmine could finish answering, Justice Gorsuch leaned forward, firing his own question. Isn't it true, Congresswoman, that states have broad authority to regulate their own elections? Why should the Supreme Court interfere? The room tensed as the questions came faster, sharper, a coordinated barrage from the bench's most conservative voices. Their strategy was clear, corner her, confuse her, force a misstep. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't look away. Instead, she planted both hands firmly on the podium, took a calm breath, and answered with steady precision, Your Honor's equality in language does not equal equality in impact. If a neutral rule consistently closes polling stations in minority communities, the result speaks louder than the text of the law itself. A ripple of whispers swept through the courtroom gallery. Justice Barrett jumped in next, raising an eyebrow. So you're suggesting intent from outcome alone? That's a high bar, Congresswoman. Jasmine met her gaze without hesitation. Not outcome alone, Justice Barrett, evidence, history, and deliberate design. We've brought all three today. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted. What was meant to be a trap had become her proving ground. The questioning had been relentless, but Jasmine Crockett didn't waver. And then she reached for the thin black binder resting on the podium. She flipped it open, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and held it steady, as though it carried the weight of the entire case. Your Honors, she began, her voice calm but firm, this is the state's own statistical analysis, and it tells a story Texas didn't want you to see. She raised the page slightly so the justices could follow along. This formula, their formula, resulted in the closure of 93% of polling locations in areas where minority voters make up more than half of the population. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single camera clicked, not a single pen scratched against paper. In the gallery, someone gasped. A reporter dropped his pen. Justice Breyer leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, scanning the page with sharp eyes. Even the conservative justices, who moments earlier had pressed her aggressively, stopped to study the numbers. Jasmine continued, her voice steady and unwavering. Out of the 300 closures across the state, 278 were concentrated in predominantly Black and Hispanic communities. Meanwhile, polling locations in affluent majority white areas increased. A low ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom, and then she delivered the blow that changed the energy in the room. This isn't my data. This isn't an estimate. These are Texas's own numbers, numbers they tried to hide. The weight of her words hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to break, and for the first time that morning, the justices were silent. The Solicitor General of Texas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat before responding. Your Honors, he said, trying to sound composed, these polling closures were necessary for budgetary reasons. The state simply didn't have the funds to keep every location open. Jasmine Crockett didn't even blink. She stepped closer to the podium, the faintest spark in her eyes, the look of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but carried enough weight to slice through the silence. Budgetary reasons, she repeated, letting the words hang in the air. If cost savings were truly the motive, Your Honors, then we'd expect these closures to be evenly distributed across the state. But here's the truth, 93% of closures happened in minority communities, while polling stations in affluent majority white areas increased. She paused, letting the numbers land like hammer blows. And even more revealing, the state's own budget report projects that these closures would save less than 0.3% of the election administration budget, yet they affect 27% of registered voters. A stunned silence filled the chamber. The Solicitor General's jaw tightened, his pen frozen above his notes. Jasmine leaned in slightly, delivering the line that flipped the entire narrative. This wasn't about saving money. This was about saving power. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Reporters stopped typing. Clerks stopped breathing. The only sound in the chamber was the low hum of the ceiling lights. And just like that, the room fell completely silent. For nearly 27 years, Justice Stephen Breyer had sat on the nation's highest bench, a man known for his relentless logic, surgical questioning, and an almost stubborn refusal to be swayed by passion. Countless attorneys had stood where Jasmine Crockett stood now, and most had left defeated, buried under the weight of Breyer's infamous hypotheticals and razor-sharp intellect. He wasn't hostile, he wasn't emotional, he was deliberate, and that made him dangerous. As the gallery waited in tense silence, Breyer leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the mahogany bench, his fingers interlaced. His gaze locked onto Jasmine like a chess master studying the next move. Then he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that silenced even the whispers in the room. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "you argue that this law discriminates without ever mentioning race. But facial neutrality is a shield courts are hesitant to pierce. Convince me. Show me why this statute cannot stand." It was an invitation and a challenge. For the briefest moment, Jasmine paused, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of the question. She inhaled deeply, her hand brushing the edge of the podium, and then met his gaze directly. When she spoke, her voice was steady, her words deliberate. "Justice Breyer, the Constitution demands more than neutral language. It demands equal opportunity. And when a law, no matter how carefully worded, consistently strips that opportunity away from millions, we must ask not what it says, but what it does." A murmur rippled softly through the courtroom. Even Breyer, the man known for his poker-faced detachment, tilted his head slightly, listening closer. For the first time in years, someone had managed to hold his full attention. The tension in the chamber was palpable. Reporters stopped typing. Lawyers froze mid-note. Every eye locked on Justice Stephen Breyer, who leaned back slightly, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. The signal everyone in the legal world recognized. He was about to deliver a trap question. His voice was calm, measured, but carried a razor's edge. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "if the court rules in your favor today and strikes down this statute, what limiting principle prevents Congress or any state from dismantling every election law it disagrees with under the guise of protecting voting rights? Where does it stop?" The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. This was the question many legal experts had feared, the one that had destroyed seasoned attorneys in past cases. For a brief moment, Jasmine Crockett stood still, her hands resting gently on the podium. Her breathing slowed. Her mind worked at lightning speed, mapping every possible consequence of her answer. Behind her, her legal team stiffened. One of her aides gripped a pen so tightly it snapped in half. Across the aisle, opposing counsel leaned back in his chair, smirking, confident this was the end of her argument. But Jasmine didn't blink. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. "Justice Breyer," she said firmly, "this court's role has never been to shield laws simply because they exist. It has always been to protect constitutional rights when they are under assault. The limiting principle is simple: intent and effect. When a law's intent or its impact systematically silences millions, the court is not dismantling democracy, it's preserving it." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Even Breyer, known for his composure, leaned forward just slightly, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. The silence that followed was electric. For the first time in the hearing, it wasn't clear who held the upper hand. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Justice Breyer's questions still lingered in the air, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, not even close. She flipped open her binder and pulled out a stack of meticulously prepared exhibits, her movements sharp and deliberate. With every step, the room leaned closer, waiting. Her voice, steady but firm, carried across the chamber. "Your Honors, this isn't a theoretical debate. This is real life, and I want to show you exactly what's at stake." She held up a chart showing a stark breakdown. 93% of polling closures occurred in minority communities. Voter registration dropped by 27% in those same areas. Meanwhile, majority white districts received 12% more polling locations. The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably. A murmur spread among the spectators. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She turned to precedent, invoking the court's own history. In Shelby County versus Holder 2013, this court removed key protections under the Voting Rights Act. And what happened within 2 years, states like Texas closed hundreds of polling places in minority neighborhoods. And in Harper versus Virginia, Board of Elections, 1966, this court ruled that wealth cannot determine access to the ballot box. Your Honors, this case is no different, except now the method of suppression is hidden behind budget excuses. A ripple of tension swept through the room. One of the clerks looked up from his laptop, his eyes wide. Reporters frantically typed, trying to capture every word. Then Jasmine delivered the line that shifted the entire atmosphere. If this court allows these closures to stand, we are not just watching history repeat itself. We are writing the next chapter of disenfranchisement. And that's when it happened. For the first time in nearly 3 decades on the bench, Justice Stephen Breyer leaned back in his chair and said nothing. The silence was deafening. For Jasmine Crockett, it was a sign her argument had landed exactly where it needed to. The air in the courtroom shifted. Every reporter, every attorney, every single person inside could sense it. Something big was coming. Jasmine Crockett calmly reached into her thin binder and pulled out a printed email chain. Without saying a word, she handed copies to the justices one by one. The faint rustle of paper filled the silence. Then, with her voice low but razor sharp, she spoke. Your Honors, these are internal communications obtained through discovery. They reveal the real intent behind these so-called budget-driven closures. Gasps rippled through the audience as she projected the emails onto the courtroom's digital screen. The words highlighted in bold red screamed across the room: eliminate 300 polling locations, reduce minority voter turnout by 27%. The weight of those sentences hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The opposing counsel shifted nervously, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the table. He tried to interrupt, but Jasmine raised a single hand, silencing him without a word. She continued, her voice growing steadier, louder, more relentless. For weeks we were told this was about saving money, but here in their own words is the real plan: shut down minority access, shrink their power, silence their votes. Murmurs erupted in the gallery. Some gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. Reporters' fingers pounded furiously against their keyboards, knowing this was history in the making. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, her voice sharp. Counselor Crockett, are you telling us the state intentionally targeted minority voters? Jasmine met her gaze unflinching. Not just targeted, Your Honor. They planned it, they documented it, and now they're exposed. The room froze. For a brief electric moment, it felt as though the walls of the Supreme Court were holding their breath. For a moment, the courtroom froze in silence. Then, like a sudden thunderclap, the reaction erupted. Reporters' fingers pounded violently on their keyboards, the rapid clicking echoing like machine gun fire. Senators leaned toward one another, whispering frantically, while cameras zoomed in on every twitch, every glance, every beat of sweat. Justice Stephen Breyer, known for his calm restraint, gave a slight nod, small, almost imperceptible, but powerful enough to ripple across the room. For someone with 27 years on the bench, it was a rare signal, and everyone understood what it meant. Justice Sotomayor leaned back, her arms, crossed eyes fixed on the defense table, like a hawk tracking its prey. On the opposite side, Justice Gorsuch scribbled furiously in his notes, his jaw tightening with every word. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel sat stone-faced, gripping his pen so tightly it looked as though it might snap in half. In the gallery, a senator murmured under his breath, This could change the entire election." Crockett, still at the podium, said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence belonged to her now. Finally, Chief Justice Roberts broke the tension, his voice low but firm. "Counselor Crockett, the court will need every single email you've obtained." Crockett nodded once, confident, unshaken. And at that precise moment, the balance of power in the courtroom shifted. The narrative was no longer about Crockett defending voting rights. It was about the state defending itself against deliberate voter suppression. History was being rewritten live. The Supreme Court chamber was packed to the brim. Reporters, senators, activists, everyone sat frozen, waiting for the moment that would decide the fate of millions of voters. Chief Justice John Roberts adjusted his glasses, looked down at the written opinion, and finally spoke. In the case of Crockett versus State of Texas, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the petitioner. For a split second, there was complete silence. Then the room erupted. Gasps, cheers, and sobs filled the chamber. Reporters scrambled to file breaking alerts. Phones buzzed non-stop and cameras flashed like lightning. Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath she'd been holding for months. She gripped the podium, her knuckles pale, her entire body trembling not from fear anymore, but from relief. Justice Sotomayor leaned toward her microphone and added, "This ruling nullifies the so-called optimization formula used to shut down polling sites. Effective immediately, the state of Texas is prohibited from closing voting locations based on demographic targeting." The words echoed across the chamber like a liberation bell. Texas' decades-long strategy had collapsed in a single ruling. Outside crowds gathered on the courthouse steps chanting Crockett's name. Some held signs that read, "Our votes matter, no more silencing." For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just a legal victory. It was a victory for democracy itself. The impact was instantaneous. Within just 72 hours, Texas election officials received a federal mandate: reopen all polling stations that were previously closed. Across the state, hundreds of voting locations came back to life. Lights switched on, ballot machines powered up, and volunteers poured in to welcome voters. And the effect was seismic. By the very next election cycle, minority voter turnout skyrocketed, up 37% statewide. Neighborhoods once silenced now roared with new voices reclaiming their constitutional right. Local news stations captured historic scenes: elderly black voters walking hand in hand with their grandchildren to cast ballots, first-time Hispanic voters cheering outside polling sites, immigrant families holding signs that read, "Our voices count, no more erasure." Jasmine Crockett stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by flashing cameras and reporters shouting her name. She raised her hand to quiet the crowd and simply said, "This victory isn't mine. It belongs to every voter who was told they didn't matter. Today, democracy breathes again." Those words traveled across the country, played on every major news network. And for millions of Americans, it felt like the system had finally heard them. The Crockett ruling didn't just change Texas. It ignited a movement. Within weeks, civil rights organizations across the country filed dozens of lawsuits challenging voter suppression laws in other states. One by one, courts began striking them down. Georgia, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina. Each state was forced to revisit its restrictive policies. CNN and NBC called it the Crockett effect. In the span of 6 months, 18 states rolled back voting restrictions. By the next national election, over 12 million voters who were previously silenced regained their constitutional rights. For the first time in years, polling stations overflowed with citizens determined to make their voices heard. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers clashed over the ruling's influence. Some called it a rebirth of democracy, while others warned it would destabilize traditional power structures. But for Jasmine Crockett, none of the noise mattered. Standing on the courthouse steps during a national press conference, she declared, "This fight was never about politics. It was about people. And today, millions more Americans have their voices back." The crowd erupted in applause. Across the country, headlines read the same: "A new era for American democracy." Years from now, law students will still open their textbooks and find an entire chapter titled The Crockett Case. Jasmine Crockett's legal battle isn't just another court victory. It's become a defining moment in American history. Professors will analyze how one woman standing alone against a powerful system used strategy, courage, and relentless determination to protect democracy itself. Inside Harvard, Yale, and Stanford lecture halls, students will dissect her arguments line by line, the evidence she presented, the precedents she cited, and the devastating precision of her rebuttals. Legal scholars are already calling it a masterclass in courtroom strategy. But beyond the technical brilliance, what truly makes the Crockett case timeless is its heart. It's a story of one voice speaking up for millions who had been silenced. It's proof that ordinary citizens can rewrite history when they refuse to back down. Across the country, murals of Jasmine Crockett have started appearing on courthouse walls, city buildings, and community centers. To many, she's no longer just a congresswoman. She's become a symbol of defiance and hope. Justice doesn't simply happen. It isn't gifted. It isn't granted. It's earned through courage, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The Crockett case proves one undeniable truth. One individual armed with preparation and unshakable determination can challenge an entire system and win. For decades, millions believed their voices didn't matter, that the system was too big, too corrupt, too powerful to fight. But Jasmine Crockett shattered that illusion. She walked into the Supreme Court alone, facing seasoned justices, veteran lawyers, and an entrenched political machine, and she didn't flinch. Her victory reminds us that democracy isn't self-sustaining. It survives only when ordinary people are willing to do extraordinary things. In classrooms, churches, and town halls across America, her story has become a rallying cry. If one person can fight for millions, then millions can fight for justice. This isn't just a courtroom win. It's a reminder true change always starts with one brave voice. This story was never just about law. It was about people, about dignity, about the unshakable belief that every voice matters. On that day inside the hallowed chambers of the Supreme Court, Jasmine Crockett proved something bigger than any legal victory. She proved that one person's courage can awaken a nation. She showed the world that truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot be silenced forever. And in that quiet, unforgettable moment, history shifted. The walls of the Supreme Court will remember her words. Generations will remember her fight. Because on that day, Jasmine Crockett stood before the highest court in America and reminded us all of a simple, eternal truth. When you stand for truth, history will always stand with you. The story of Jasmine Crockett teaches us one powerful truth. Change doesn't happen by chance. It happens when ordinary people choose to be brave. No matter who you are, where you come from, or how impossible the fight may seem, your voice matters. One person standing for justice can spark a movement that transforms millions of lives. In our daily lives, we face moments where silence feels easier than speaking up. But remember, this history is never written by those who stay quiet. Stand for truth, stand for fairness. Because when you do, history will stand with you. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like this video to support the fight for truth. Comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your voice. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss powerful stories like this one. Together we amplify voices. Together we make history.